Well, as you all see, we have with us the main teacher of this course, and we're all delighted, Mr. Blair, that you're here with us. What I propose that we will do this session is I'll offer some summary remarks about our previous session and then introduce briefly the session today. And then Mr. Blair is going to give about 20 minutes or so comments, followed by Q&A. Then we'll take a break and reconvene and then broaden the conversation to involve readings as well as your experiences that you bring to this course into the question of what are the stakes with globalization and the relationship between globalization and faith today. So let me just offer a few summary first remarks about our first session. We affirmed, of course, the significance of faith as a factor. In many events, faith plays a significant role, positive as well as negative. We also noted that it virtually never is the sole factor and suggested that all monocausal explanations of complex events ought to be suspect, and therefore also all monocausal explanations in terms of religious role. But nonetheless, religion remains significant. And the interesting thing also that came up in our case study or presentation about case study by John Kelsey is that he underscored the significance of religion, but not just as motivating acts of violence in this case, and not simply legitimizing at the bottom, whether at the bottom political or other goals, but in a sense providing a larger framework in which to understand human life, and as such motivating actions, which of course had such horrendous consequences. That is, there was an idea of the human flourishing behind bin Laden's initiative. We noted also ambivalence of concrete faiths, various kinds of ambivalences. Both from the external perspective, they appear both positive and negative, but also from internal perspective, they do so as well. And there is this long debate within faiths themselves about what constitutes the proper employment of faith, proper understanding of faith, proper action in the world on the basis of faith. And now in our session 2, we asked the question, well, how is this significant as well as ambivalent phenomenon called faith? How is that phenomenon related to globalization processes? And more specifically, what is at stake when we talk about faith in relationship to globalization processes? I will start, and I'll start by briefly defining our terms and by sketching forms of impact that faith can have on globalization. And then Mr. Blair will take it from there and talk more specifically to the heart of our issue, that is what is at stake when we raise this question and examine it. So, first terminology. We don't intend here to offer definitions that will give us essence of faith or essence of globalization. We want to specify what we mean for the purposes of our conversation by faith, by globalization, by highlighting certain features of these two phenomena. And it's also a flexible definition, open to be changed as we go along. So what is globalization? Globalization, I think we understand by the planetary process, which was historically driven primarily by interest in, and here I am drawing on Nayan Chanda's work, trade, learning about and spreading religion, conquest, and adventure. And probably in today's world, is most important driving force of it is capitalism connected with trade. But it's a planetary process leading to, and here I'll be drawing on some of our readings that we had, leading to a world with high levels of interconnectivity in which communication of goods and services flow freely. A world of, second, interdependence that is planetary in scope, with only relatively few and diminishing independent localities. And the world in which space has contracted, in which the world itself has become new locality, and people are increasingly demoored from a specific territory. Some people talk about disembedded cosmopolitanism as a feature of globalization. And then fourthly, that there is a widespread consciousness of the world as a global whole. Those are the four features of globalization. Now, what is faith? Faith, by faith, we don't mean, we've discussed this, right? Quite a bit. And in our readings, it's complicated discussions, which will be now reduced to relatively a simple thing. Faith is not abstract religiosity of which concrete faiths are specific instantiations. No such abstract religiosity actually exists. There may be generic brands of products, there are many of those, but there's no generic believers. They're all specific, branded, so to speak, believers. Faiths come in concrete shape, and believers believe concrete faiths. So what are some of the features of those great faith traditions? What are some of the features of faith as we use it in this course? First, they have at least these following features. Provide an overarching interpretation of reality with some claim to ultimacy. Provide an overarching interpretation of reality with some claim to ultimacy. Now, situate account of human flourishing within that interpretation of reality. And then thirdly, provide guidance to people how they should live and motivation to live in this way. Now, you'll notice probably that something like Marxism or humanism or even neoliberalism may function as quasi-religion given this definition. We'll keep in mind also a relatively recent phenomenon when we speak about religions, and that is smorgasbord religiosity, which is neither a religious tradition nor some vague religiosity, but it is a concrete religious stance that people take in contemporary world, and it's a concrete religious stance that is kind of created by individuals to satisfy their own religious needs. And content is kind of drawn in ad hoc fashion from a variety of sources, and often without being inserted in any overarching perspective on life. That too, I think, is a consequence of globalization on the shape which faith is taking today. So that's roughly what we mean by faith. Faith traditions with these specified features and this relatively vague smorgasbord religiosity. Now, faith and globalization, my next point, is a kind of complex relationship. And it is a very complex relationship. One way to look at this relationship is to ask, what is the impact, what are the impacts of globalization processes on faith? We'll sketch that impact probably more in greater detail in our next session. And today will be more concerned about faith's engagement in globalization processes. I just want to note that the influence goes both ways, not just from faith to globalization, but in very significant ways from globalization to faith. The very shape of faith, the very modes of communication of faith are all shaped by the situation in which we find ourselves today in the globalized world. So, faith's engagement with globalization processes. Now, obviously, the first question is the possibility of influence on part of faiths of the globalization processes, and the assumption of the course that such influence is possible, that faiths are significant in the world today, and that they're significant in an ambivalent way. As we noted in our last session, this is a contested assumption, but nonetheless, I think it's a reasonable one. Now, let me indicate briefly forms of impact of faith on globalization processes. Obviously, there are such things as negative impacts, ambiguity of religion. We emphasized ambivalence of religion. And these are often kind of identical, maybe with kind of generally negative aspects of faith. I want to highlight two. Some people think of faith as simply being irrational, right? Opposing important scientific and technological developments, or opposing significant social advances. So there's a possible negative impact as irrationality of faith. It's important to note that from the perspective of the believers themselves, they wouldn't describe that as irrational. They wouldn't see that as opposition between faith and reason. They would see that as, from particular perspectives, sketching a reasonable understanding of how to orient oneself in the world. That too is part and parcel of the ambiguity of faith. Second negative aspect is violence generating potential of faith. Creates strong and exclusivist loyalties and legitimizes struggle against others. And this negative impact of faith is magnified in a highly interdependent world, given that major disruptions in one part have repercussions in just about all other parts of the globe. Again, from the perspective of people of faith, faith that is deemed violent often is not seen as simply engaging in blind violence, but rather sometimes is perceived as being engaged in struggle to live a way of life deemed good. Now, we may not agree either with the way how some people of faith describe what is deemed irrational behavior. We may not agree with them how they describe their violent behavior, but it's important for us to understand that they're not outbursts of irrationality, outbursts of violence, that they have internal reasons, and only if we understand those internal reasons will we be able to engage in, I think, creative and constructive ways with such traditions. Now, faiths obviously have also positive impact. One, to latch on to the idea of connection between faith and violence, fostering authentic reconciliation. We read in our texts about militants for peace. Motivating and energizing people for more effective participation in variety of settings. There is in the Christian tradition and Jewish tradition of divine blessing, where God blesses wide varieties of efforts. That is too how people of faith draw on their faith. Also, helping people in misfortune, oppression, or failure. There is in those traditions also kind of deliverance tradition of faith. Faith helps when things break down. Helping people to live meaningful lives, notwithstanding failure, oppression, misfortune, and energizing people to help others. But I think if the function of faith in the context of globalization or in general were to be reduced to this blessing, delivering, and reconciling, I think that suspicion could arise that faith is simply a clutch in globalization processes. In interface with globalization, faith is then made, possibly, suspicion would be that faith is made subservient to the ends of globalization. Take the question of blessing. That blessing, if that's what faith does, simply blesses the endeavors, well, faith can be deemed as, maybe in negative terms, as a performance-enhancing drug, right? Or if faith is only about deliverance, right, it will be kind of religious band-aid. Or if faith is involved just in reconciling processes, well, it might be deemed as simply social lubricant, right? Which is, in all these three ways, faith would be instrumentalized. And background assumption is that people of faith worry for something that is ultimate to them to being instrumentalized in what they deem to be penultimate ends. Faith then would be betrayed. To retain their own integrity as faiths must, I think, seek to shape globalization processes in accordance with a vision of human flourishing, formulated within the overarching vision of reality. To shape globalization processes in accordance with a vision of human flourishing, and provide ultimate framework, I think, of meaning within which globalization processes make sense. So for faith, I think that's probably true to say, maybe it's controversial and we can discuss it. For faiths, globalization processes are an instrument. They're not an end, right? What does that mean for globalization processes? What does that mean for faith traditions as their interface with globalization processes? I think those are very important issues for us to grapple and to understand that as an inherent feature of what faiths are about. So, just briefly, let me make a foray into what might be at stake with globalization processes. I think in many ways it's not too much to say that the future of our globalized world is at stake. A world in which people of different cultures have been brought into proximity with one another, a world in which people of different cultures are increasingly dependent on one another and increasingly see themselves as citizens of one world. And maybe what is at stake can be expressed in the following questions. Will all citizens of that one world live in genuine and just peace with one another, or will they be mired in irresolvable conflicts? 2, will globalization processes be harnessed to help them to better pursue authentic human flourishing in the context of well-being of all creation? Or will those processes seduce them to pursue unreachable goal of finding satisfaction in pursuit of pleasure, power, or whatever that might be? I think those are some of the central questions formulated, at least from the perspective of the people of faith. What is at stake in engagement of faith with globalization? I shall end here and cede this place to Mr. Blair.
Thank you very much, Miroslav. And I hope you don't mind if I just begin by thanking Yale for giving me the opportunity to meet you and to take this course, and to thank all of you for coming along and participating in it. Because I want you to do a lot more for me than I'm able to do. Okay? So that's the thing, you see. And listening to Miroslav there, it reminded me of that I was never clever enough to be a professor. That's why they put me into politics, see? Now, what I'd like to try and do is explain to you how I see this linkage between faith and globalization, and how I think we can make our work yield some good and important benefits. And as you probably know, it's in part linked to my my foundation, which is about the whole area of interfaith and how we get people of different religious faiths to work and live together. I also, this causes some surprise to people, particularly in my old calling in politics, because I genuinely believe that the issue to do with faith and globalization, religious belief and global change, is the single most important and determining issue of the 21st century, which is a big claim to make. Faith is important because it motivates so many people, and because, as we know and as you were exploring last week, of its potential to do harm. But it's also important because of its potential to do good. And I believe there is a way in which faith can be the humanizing and civilizing influence on the process of globalization. In another part of my life, I'm the Quartet, which is the international community representative for the Middle East peace process. And one of the interesting things for someone of my religious background is that you go around the Holy Land and you see all these very famous sites from the Bible. And I was in Jericho not so long ago, and my Palestinian guide, who was showing me around, turned to me and said at one point, as he looked out over the Jordan Valley and then Jerusalem in the distance and so on, and he said, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, why do they all have to come here? And it was his way of saying that in his situation, here he was in this quite small geographical space, which of course is the source of such conflict and difficulty at the moment, knowing that he and his children would have to live and work together with their neighbors, but with this enormous difference, cultural and religious, keeping them apart from their neighbors. So my point about this really is very simple. Globalization, defined as Miroslav has just so excellently done, globalization pushes people together It pushes them together economically and socially. It produces waves of migration. The communication of what is happening in the world now crosses frontiers with instant ease and accessibility. And the effect of this is that globalization is something that is seen as very modern, but its impact is at every point to push people into the same space. And with that, of course, comes tremendous opportunities. I mean, if I look around the class, I mean, you are a representation of that. People from many, many different parts of the world and come to this great institution of learning. And that is really a normal part of what we expect to happen now. But if you go back some generations, that would have been somewhat unusual. Right. So globalization, in my view, by breaking down some of the barriers and pushing people together, actually has a very positive aspect to it. It provides opportunity for people who otherwise wouldn't get opportunity. It expands our horizons, our ability to know more about the world in which we live. But it also, of course, brings with it risks and dangers and tensions. Because what happens when traditional frontiers of community or nationhood break down is that people also feel under threat. They feel under threat about their own way of life, their own way of thinking. If you study in my country, and of course in this country too, the waves of migration and how they have been assimilated, that process of assimilation has been tough. And it's been tough because those global forces of change do open up these new horizons for people, but sometimes people don't want those horizons opened up. They find them threatening and disturbing. But the thing about globalization, which is why a lot of the political debate about it is often so redundant, is that it's a fact. It's not going to stop. It's only going to intensify. And it's also powerful. And you only have to look at what's happening to the financial sector of the world economy at the moment to realize that the moment something happens here, it translates right across the world. And that's not just because it's the United States, it's because of the integration of the world economy. Now with faith, that, although globalization is seen as a modern phenomenon, faith is often seen as something somewhat more old-fashioned, and certainly in the Western world, sometimes people see faith very much as something from the past, not in all parts of the West, but in many parts. But it is also a fact, and it is also powerful. When we look at the most recent polling that's been undertaken in this, and we ask the question, is religion an important or very important part of your life? The figures in Europe hover around the 30% mark. Here in the US, it's over 60%. In many parts of the world, particularly Islamic parts of the world, it's well over 90%. And the fact is, there are billions of people in our world today for whom faith matters. I think it matters, although it's one of the things that I think we should explore during the course of our endeavor. I think I would identify three aspects to faith when we talk about it as an objective force in our society, in our world. One is that faith can become a means of self-identity. It can become a means of saying that this defines my culture, this defines my political attitude. It's about identity. I think a second aspect of faith is that it's just part of my tradition. And that's a little different from identity. Identity is something living and present. The tradition is something that comes from the past. But people will say, well, I grew up in a certain type of society that was defined by my faith. It doesn't mean to say that they personally necessarily are people of faith, but they would recognize that that is the tradition from which they come. And then I think there's a third way in which faith to people matters and can be expressed, and that is faith as what I would call a spiritual awakening. In other words, faith as it defines my values and beliefs, not in a cultural sense so much, but in a personal sense. And so if you ask people to describe religion, there are some people who will describe it in terms of identity. There are some people who will simply say, well, this is part of my tradition. But then there are other people for whom this is the most important thing in their life, because it's about how they live their life in what they perceive to be a good way. So it's spiritual. And I think when we examine the impact of faith in those different ways, we can see, as you saw last week, the good, which is the Jubilee campaign, and the bad, which is faith leading to extremism, leading to violence, leading to the loss of innocent life. But the one thing is for sure is that faith in our world can be an immensely strong justification for your action. It can be the motivating and galvanizing force behind what you do and why you do it. And the reason I say this is so important for the 21st century is the 20th century, in my view, is the century of political ideology. And although, as you can see very well from what's going on in your country at the moment, we produce great political turmoil and debate and division and dissension over who should be elected the president or who should win an election in Britain. Nonetheless, actually, the era of the great dominating political ideology that was the answer to everything, communism, totalitarianism, is over. That's not to say there aren't political differences, but they form up in a quite different way in the 21st century than the 20th, within more narrow parameters, within a far larger pool of consensus. But religious ideology has the possibility of supplanting that political ideology for good or for bad. Because when people ask, well, why is it that you link faith to globalization? It is precisely because if globalization, as Miroslav was saying, is a force that pushes people together, if religion becomes a force that pulls people apart, if, in other words, it is not about your spirituality, but becomes a means of identifying yourself in opposition, in exclusion to others, then religion becomes a force that can be immensely destructive. So what I sometimes say to people about globalization and about politics today is that, you know, distinctions between left and right matter, but actually as important as anything else today is the distinction between what I would call open versus closed. Right? Because globalization is an opening up process, the question is your attitude to that, yes, that's good, now how do we make it work? Or your attitude to that is, that's bad, that's taking away something of my identity, something of what defines me, and I want to stop it. Now, religion in those circumstances, therefore, and religious faith, that can be a means either of saying, well, let us open up to one another and reach out across our different faiths, respecting our own faith and identity, but being prepared to reach out to the faith and identity of others. Or it can be a means of saying, this is how I'm going to define myself, and in distinction to you. Because you're coming into the space that I'm inhabiting is actually threatening my religious belief and my faith. So that is one major aspect of the whole issue to do with faith and globalization. Is it, if globalization pushes people together, is religious faith a part of making that work, or does it become part of pulling people apart? But I actually have a bigger ambition for what we want to do here, which is also to explore the possibility, not that we prevent faith from doing harm, but that we try and show and see how faith can do good. Because the thing about globalization is that it is a fact, it is powerful, and it does provide opportunity, but, as again we can see, it is and can be highly impersonal. It can lead to a materialism that is actually value-free. It can lead to injustice with people who are left behind. And I think in the future it can do something else. It can lead to a competition for resources, particularly as China and India industrializes, and there is a developing of the world economy, increases in population, pressure on food as a commodity, which you can see already. That process of globalization, which will create these types of challenges, the environment and climate change will be another. If it is value-free, the danger is it is essentially a competitive process decided by power. So those people that have the power will get the resources. Those people who do not have the power will not. And so that very thing that globalization should be, which is an open up of opportunity, actually becomes a means of creating a fundamental divide between those who succeed in this world of globalization and those who fail. Now, the question I would pose is this: is it possible for religious faith to be a part, not an exclusive part, but a part of providing a value system that brings notions of equity and justice and fairness into this otherwise strong but often impersonal process of globalization? Can it, in other words, develop and shape the value system of globalization? So, what I'd like to do in the course of our discussions over this semester and the time to come is really trying to explore these types of issues. Explore things like why do people still have such strong religious faith? Why are people still willing to come forward and stand up and say that they have religious belief, when certainly at one time it was assumed that as there was economic and political and social development, faith would be relegated to an interesting part of our history? How do we remove the ignorance that breeds the fear, that breeds the conflict in relation to faith? I think for the Abrahamic faith certainly, but more widely than that, there's huge ignorance. I say this as someone of faith about other faiths. The more I learn, the more I'm fascinated to learn. You know, the more I see, for example, when I study the Quran, the more I see why we call them the Abrahamic faiths, and why actually an understanding of Islam and how it has developed is not merely important for me to understand another culture or another group of people, but actually is potentially a very enriching source of knowledge for my own faith. How do we describe what our relationship would be in the future with civilizations, Hindu or Buddhist, that are going to be immensely governed by how those faiths came about, the value system underpinning them, what the impact of those faces been on the sociological development of what are vast and growing important parts of the world? How do we educate people about this? How do we make sure that the faiths act in a way together to deal with some of the critical issues in the world today? One of the things my foundation does is try to get the faiths to act in pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals, for example, in the malaria campaign. And then how do we make sure that for this work that we're engaged in, we can start identifying those things that maybe we need to probe further in terms of research or in terms of information? What are the case studies that would be really interesting for us to look at in terms of seeing the tensions between faith and globalization and how they can be improved? And I hope finally also that we're able to do something else, which is to have an interfaith encounter. In other words, sometimes, when people talk about interfaith dialogue, there are lots and lots. I go to a lot of interfaith sessions. There's an immense amount of dialogue. I've had a lot of dialogue. And what would be nice is to get some product at the end of it. And I think one of the things that we can look at is what would be the right way for the faiths to encounter each other and to learn from each other. And finally, to end where I began, I think when I'm out in the Middle East, I see the good and the bad side of faith. And I see the conflict that it is part of, and I see the work that is being done by people of faith to overcome historic divisions that have caused the death of so many people over the years. And I think if we were able to find a way of reconciling people to each other in that region, what a symbol it would be for peaceful coexistence for the future. So for me, this is a very practical thing. I mean, I am fascinated in the theology of it, actually, and I'm fascinated by the different doctrinal aspects of it. But most of all, I'm motivated by wanting to make the 21st century work for people. Work for people because as we open up, we offer opportunity to people, and work for people because in getting and in spending, we do not waste our lives. That in other words, we have some spiritual core to the lives that we lead. Because I think in the end, that is really the only thing that makes life properly fulfilling. So these are bold ambitions for our course here at Yale, but I am immensely excited at the prospect of working with you. I'm sure I shall learn a lot from you, and I think that this is just the beginning of something that will be really important for the future. And sometimes, as I've learned in my life, out of the very small things grow the very big things. Thank you.